All right. So we reunite months later after our epic, protracted discussion of education and its
Virtual
future
Exodus.
and the virtual exodus, gaming addiction. And we were just kind of chatting a little bit before. We were thinking we'd take a lighter stab at the intellectual world tonight because we both noticed that we seem to have gotten on a bit of a sci-fi kick recently, um, catalyzed by the release of Dune, which I have seen once in IMAX and thoroughly enjoyed the experience, even though that's definitely outside of my comfort zone, what I'm normally interested in. I thought the experience was a delightful bit of sensory overload. And I thought that there was definitely enough substance to the movie to justify the outrageous style that it was in, which is rare quality in a movie like that. And I had never read the book, but I understand you
Oh,
have.
yeah, I read it a year and a half ago
Okay, and it's
while we were
such.
driving across the American Southwest desert. So it was
Oh,
appropriate.
I remember you talking about that. Yeah, and I think that I mean I've definitely gleaned the sort of the basic plot outline just because it's such a famous book, and I've been interested in sci-fi before, but I'd never read it, so it was mostly a new experience of that world for me. And you've seen it 5 times and read the book, so I think
Yeah,
you've really allowed it to penetrate your soul at this point.
that is true. That's true. Yeah. By accident, the fifth time was not entirely my choice, but I did consent to go. So I suppose I can be somewhat blamed. But it was really good, and it was still good the fifth time. It was impressive.
Fair, fair. And to me, I think the success of something like that right now got me thinking about the sci-fi genre, or even if you want to make it more a broader category, like speculative fiction, which I enjoy more. The idea where it's like you could take any sort of hypothetical situation related to the human condition and write a story about what if this was the case. And it doesn't necessarily restrict the genre to hard science, although that can be cool too. But I think just speculative fiction in general, I think is where I would draw the genre boundaries here. And I think Dune has those qualities, even though there are many of the originated within Dune, but now, stereotypes of the
Tropes.
sci-fi tropes of the sci-fi genre. Um, and I was kind of thinking about this the other day, like why I was moved to revisit that genre, because I don't know if you really um, did this as much growing up, but I remember being endlessly fascinated by those large boxes of old sci-fi magazines that Dad had in the basement or in the upstairs of the old house. And I remember just being mesmerized as a little kid just by the cover art,
Yeah.
especially ones that were like, some of them were from the 60s and 70s too. So you have classic vintage cover design, but also just this sort of miraculous feel that these had somehow survived. And you were looking at something, which was at that point, from 30 years ago. And most of the names had been kind of lost to the sands of time. There were a few famous ones that you would see. And I remember coming across like a lot of really interesting, like original publications of like famous Robert Heinlein works, like
Hmm.
Starship Troopers, a review of the original, like the first Star Wars in 1972 or something like that.
77.
77. Yeah. Sorry.
Please,
77.
Dave.
Yeah. I see. I see. I'm that big of a sci-fi fan. And um, I do recall reading some of the stories as I got older and finding it something that excited the imagination more than most fiction that I encountered at that point. And there was a time when I really devoured it and even started kind of reading what was then current coming out in the newsstand magazines, which was very different. A lot of it more like had kind of an MFA in creative writing level of polish and style to it that the older stuff certainly did not, in good and bad ways. But then I feel like towards late high school and then into college, I pretty much completely dropped the genre and haven't really read it at all, other than a few isolated novels like The Three Body Problem, which I don't know if you've read that, but
Thomas and you at this point have
yeah.
both been saying it's just, and one of my managers at the grocery store of all things, when he found out that I liked books, one of the first books he mentioned was, "Have you read The Three Body Problem?" I'm like, "Have you?" Like, this
Yeah.
doesn't seem like it's a pretty niche, even as sci-fi novels go, it's pretty niche. Thomas has never been able to adequately explain the premise to me, so it must be good.
It is good. It's just a highly complex book. It takes a lot of work to understand it, but you want to work at it. Like, it's worth it. That can be for another. I mean, but really, other than that, I haven't really dipped into sci-fi at all. But after Dune, I noticed myself in the last week or so just feeling an urge to kind of revisit it a little bit. And I've read some Ted Chiang too, who's more in the more speculative fiction realm. But anyway, I picked up one of those anthologies edited by a guy named Gardner Dozois, I guess is how you say his name. And he was a long-standing editor of Asimov Science Fiction magazine, who did a long-running yearly collection of, like, the X annual best of science fiction and of short fiction. And so I picked up a collection that was just the best of the best that he had put together in the mid 2000s, where he chose the best stories out of all the anthologies that he had made for about 35 years. And I've been working my way through that, just kind of picking stories at random. And it's hard to say exactly what is appealing, but I like the idea. I like the way that it can kind of make you live philosophy to some extent, because I think that fiction, both in movie and in book form, kind of allows you to go through the emotional learning of somebody else. And when you are talking about speculative fiction in particular, you're kind of like living a hypothetical philosophical proposition. Like, what if things were this way? What kind of changes would you undergo in your own personal hero's journey? And I think it's a powerful vehicle for philosophical reflection, but from a completely different angle. And we've talked about this before. Like, I have a personal tendency to get hung up on analysis and more rigid philosophical discussion, but kind of rediscovering sci-fi and the ability to sort of just put yourself in the world and live it. And especially in short fiction, I think it's even more punchy. Just live it for just a little moment, and then you come away and you're like, what was that? I'm curious to see kind of how that strikes you, thinking of it as lived philosophy. And any kind of literature, a great novel is certainly lived philosophy to some extent. But to me, it seems like sci-fi lends itself the best, speculative fiction lends itself the best to that type of experience of taking a little nugget of an idea and letting you live it for a second.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about it like that before. I think it's a little too broad to just qualify for sci-fi, but that's an interesting way of putting it. That it's and I like it better than the way I know a lot of people, kind of from my sort of academic, kind of Catholic academic crowd, and this is certainly not all of them, but at least a vein of the people that I know see reading literature as it's primarily for the sake of supplementing your moral experience. It's like, that's not wrong, but it seems like the idea of literature as a kind of vicarious philosophy, vicarious lived philosophy, that's a richer idea. It's not foreign to the idea of kind of supplementing and expanding your moral experience, but it goes beyond just the moral aspect. But I think, though, that it seems like there's got to be something specific to sci-fi, which gives it that which makes it uniquely suited, like you're saying, to.
Yeah. Like, I think, to interject real quick, I think it allows you to supplement your moral development by living the morality of ideas, maybe. Because I think the best sci-fi tackles an ethical question too, in obvious cases being things like AI. Like, if an AI does become conscious and intelligent to the point where it's indistinguishable from a human, what kind of rights does it have? Those kind of things. But if it can put you in this where you take a hypothetical idea and then experience like the morality of it through a character, to me that seems like maybe a way that it's an exceptional aid to philosophy in the way that other literature maybe not quite so much.
That's interesting. I like that direction then a little bit more, because it seems like how would I put this? Um, it seems like you're not going to get, how do I want to phrase this thought? Um, in the case of this kind of lived philosophy idea, you're talking about sort of living the morality of ideas. It seems like what's crucial for science fiction in particular is speculative fiction, which I think was the original term for it
Yeah.
when it was kind of becoming a thing, or fantastic fiction.
Yeah.
Um, it seems like the underlying assumption is that your circumstances and your sort of your material and social environment um, have a strong influence on the way you live and relate to the world. So that in the light of just kind of giving a historical view of it, in light of the fact that you start to see in the late 19th and early 20th century massive environmental and social changes wrought by um, the mass recourse to technology, you start to, it kind of awakens a speculative mind to realize, well, wait a minute, if mores and if structures and if life itself seems to be this dependent on circumstances, then what if the classic what if question starts to get asked, like what if
Yeah.
we were to change, what if we could do something to change the environment in this way or in that way, how
Yeah.
would that affect circumstances? And it seems like that it's that crucial what if idea that seems to characterize science fiction in particular. Because I think I remember talking to Dad at some point, because Dad was one of the long-haired weirdos who went to sci-fi conventions back in the 70s, and
It was.
he has definite ideas about what sci-fi is. And I think at one point in time he said
We
something
should,
along,
to interject, maybe we should have him on this show to talk about sci-fi, do a follow-up.
that would be
Interesting perspective.
awesome.
Okay, we'll bracket that. But yeah, go ahead.
I think at one point in time, maybe when he comes on, he could correct this, but I thought something he said was that science fiction in its purest and classical form always starts with the assumption that, okay, there's some scientific innovation we're going to hypothesize. How does that change the world, and how would people respond to that? So it seems like the idea of a lived philosophy, or giving you the lived experience of the world as changed in this or that way by something scientific, seems to be the uniquely sci-fi aspect. So it takes the idea of kind of giving you that experience, giving you that expansive experience of reading literature, but kind of gives it its specific aspect of being it's expansive in precisely a way which is otherwise impossible. Like, it's not in the sense of, like, if you read like typical literature, not like fantasy or something, but just like what goes for classic literature, like Jane Austen, or which is, I like Jane Austen, but or Faulkner or something, where it's largely an exploration of human feeling in slightly more exaggerated but still possible human circumstances.
Yeah.
So that theoretically you could have those experiences yourself, and you wouldn't need having the literature there helps to kind of anticipate that, and helps you, almost prepares you in a way for responding in a more responsible fashion, and kind of reflecting more responsibly on your life if you should have something like that experience. But in the case of science fiction, what's unique is it's expanding your experience of the world into territories which it's actually impossible, or at least virtually impossible, for you to ever experience otherwise, which I think is what makes it so pleasant and interesting. Is that, like, because when you're, like you're saying, when you're within that world, when you're reading Dune, or when you're reading Stories of Your Life by Ted Chiang, as long you're there in a world which as far as you know, and maybe sometimes thankfully can't exist, but you're part of it. And if the person's a good writer, then you're really kind of, you're experiencing something that can't exist, and yet you're still somehow experiencing it. It's really fascinating.
And it's teaching you something about yourself. And, actually, when you put it that way, it did make me think, when you talked about experiencing something that couldn't happen, what came up for me was how a lot of my favorite sci-fi stories are less about a scientific invention and more about a what if in regards to our limitations as humans and how we experience the world. So, and what if those limits didn't exist? Or maybe what if a scientific intervention removed a radical limit that we have? And I can think of two stories that come to mind, which I don't know if you've read either of these. I kind of think maybe not. But the first one is a novel called Beggars in Spain by Nancy Kress.
I think you've mentioned that before.
It was an excellent novel. I mean, I read that maybe in high school towards the end of my sci-fi days. But the basic premise is like, what if some genetic engineering experiment allowed scientists to produce people who didn't need to sleep?
Okay, yes, you've mentioned this. I think maybe
Yeah.
even in one of these previous podcasts, actually.
I may have. It definitely made an impression on me because it's such a simple thing. You think like, oh yeah, I mean, like, I guess you could get more done. You'd be more productive. You'd probably be more stressed out. Whatever. You have a few vague, generic thoughts about it. But she draws out the consequences of this for both the individuals and for society in the macro level. Like that innovation and having that class of people exist changes society completely. And the other one that I could think, and that was a novel length, so she really explored all the socio-political dimensions of that, and from the inner world of one of the people who couldn't sleep, and so didn't understand the reactions that they were receiving from those who did need to sleep, just because this was not a concept for them, and all the obvious advantages, like being able to come, just to attain knowledge and mastery of skills at twice the speed of anybody else. I think that is a really interesting one, where it examines our human limitations and then takes it away and and shows what would unfold. And the other one that I can think of that I feel very confident that you haven't read, because I found it in some random anthology years ago, but it also made a big impression on me, was a story called The Persistence of Vision by a guy named John Varley, who I don't know much about, other than it was a late 70s story that won a lot of sci-fi awards. But that premise is, he starts with a story about, which I don't know if this was real or not, but like an epidemic of rubella, the disease rubella, which was apparently harmless for healthy adults or even children, but was exceptionally dangerous for pregnant women and causing birth defects. And so the premise of the story is that there was a rubella outbreak, and a far higher number than normal of children were born with birth defects. And I think the main birth defect is that it makes you blind and deaf, and in many cases also mentally disabled as well. But he took the premise, what if there was all of a sudden, this huge burst of people that had this problem from this 1 year of rubella, and then examines kind of how many of them would be weeded out because of mental disabilities and sink into horrible situations in a home somewhere, and they'd be unreachable. And then it talks about how the government made a program to try to, because there were so many of them, to try to intercede and help them. And many of them, and that didn't even work. But that there was like this class of blind, deaf individuals who kind of made it. Like, they had high IQs, the education got through to them, they learned how to interface with the world. And then in the story, these individuals decide, once they come of age, and they take kind of the government grant that they received, and they go off and start a commune in New Mexico, where the sole goal is to make a life that is perfectly suited for blind, deaf individuals. And the rule is, we're not taking anything for granted from wider society, because that may not work for us. So anything goes that is conducive to us living a good life as blind, deaf individuals. And then it follows the protagonist is kind of this drifter who loses his job in an economic depression, and is kind of making his way through other communes out in the Southwest and commenting on what he sees there. And then he stumbles across this place, which has been in effect for over 10 years or so at that point. And he ends up staying at this place and immersing himself in this community of people that are blind and deaf and communicate entirely through touch. There's no talking. And then it sets up that speculative scenario where it's like, what do symbolic language and visual cues and verbal language what hidden limitations do those forms all have, and how much are we limiting ourselves by the fact that we use that? And what would happen if there was this much more visceral, direct way of communicating
Hmm.
solely through touch? And aside from just being a crazy good premise, I think, for a speculative story, I think it delivers on the problem. And there's definitely some weird 70s elements to it that don't age well, but the core of the story, I think, is a striking little examination of an idea of like, if you remove a limitation, what do you get? What unfolds? What does the human condition do when it moves into that space? So all that was a lot, but I think both of those are kind of stories I would recommend people take a look at. I remember them well. I hope that they've aged well since I read them, but of great examples of what I think speculative fiction can do. And for me, just living that for a second, you really do learn, I think, you learn something that you can't, like, if you were just talking about that in the abstract.
Yeah,
Yeah.
both of those sound awesome. Especially that last one sounds like, who on earth would, I guess if you happen to, maybe he knew people because Rebella was a bigger problem in the 60s and 70s, but
Yeah.
who would think of that?
It's
Such
just
a cool idea.
I know, it's just a great idea. Like, as soon as, like, I remember picking that up at random and starting to read maybe 4 or 5 pages, and as soon as I kind of like grasped the premise, I was like, ooh, yeah, no, I'm gonna read this whole thing. Like, I don't know where it's gonna go, but like, it's just such a great setup, and it's such a foreign environment, but also something that is within the realm of possibility that could occur. And
Hmm.
what would it change if you, as somebody who was not born blind and deaf, suddenly like go living in this place and trying to learn like touch languages? And what would a society of entirely blind deaf people be? How different would it be? In what ways would it be different from mainstream society?
That's so cool. What an
Yeah,
interesting idea.
yeah,
That's that's kind of interesting then, because this thought just occurred to me now that if it seems essential to science fiction that it seems like at some level every sci-fi story, whether hard science or not, um, is going to be somehow or other about that kind of what if sort of thing. It seems like that's one of the things. In order for something to qualify as science fiction, you don't need spaceships. You need that kind of like reflecting on an alternative um, way of being in light of some kind of change. It seems like that might make sense of the fact that science fiction, in a certain sense, has an entirely self-contained set of homegrown archetypes,
yeah.
in the
Mhm.
sense of like fantasy and a lot of traditional literature, way back into mythic literature, and then a lot of religious text. You can see sort of echoes of the archetypes that you see Jung talking about, the animus and the anima, and so on, the trickster,
Yeah,
and sort of you're playing out those sort of intrinsic archetypal relationships and struggles and inclinations. But it seems like the whole idea of science fiction is, what if there were what if the archetypes, what if we weren't limited by that kind of archetypal structuring of the unconscious? What if
mm.
or not, that's not, they're not all like that, but it seems like science fiction pushes the limits of, if the idea is remove a limit, see what happens, then it seems like it's intrinsically opposed to the idea of always telling stories that have recourse to some kind of and it's really hard to say exactly what it's like, but you know the hero
Yeah,
in a story. You can just kind of see someone fits the bill for it. It's not always clear who whether there is a hero in a sci-fi story or something, because it's not so much about exploring those kind of archetypal relationships. There are tropes in sci-fi, but it seems like, that's why I said they're like homegrown archetypes.
yeah,
But it seems like the whole idea of science fiction is to kind of have an open-ended genre where technically anything could happen, and you're not limited by these sorts of explorations of kind of, not preconceived. I don't know exactly how to put it, but is this a completely unintelligible thought, or do you kind of get, because it seems like in fantasy, at least, fantasy is sort of the archetypal story
yeah,
where, and then on
yeah,
the other hand, it seems like we're in that case, there's a kind of closed, I mean, I like fantasy, but there's a kind of closed, you're almost stripping away the things that obscure the archetypes in fantasy,
Mhm.
whereas in and you're kind of seeing those primal relationships, those primal urges, in a way that's supposed to be more clear and in many ways more cathartic. Whereas in science fiction, it seems like you're not stripping away the externals. In a certain sense, you're kind of muting the archetypes and adjusting the externals and seeing what happens.
Yeah, that's muting the archetypes. That is an interesting way to put it.
It kind of came out of left field, I realized, but like,
Yeah, no, it's
just trying to
interesting.
think of, because fantasy and science fiction are so often juxtaposed as like these are the two genres. If people don't want to write boring novels about people getting drunk and being unhappy, which is so much of what modern novels and short stories are,
Yeah,
um, a lot of the artistry that's being done is in those two genres. But how do it seems like sci-fi is very
yeah,
different.
yeah.
How is it different?
That's really true. I feel like I've noticed that ever since I got a Kindle e-reader, like maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Like
Shame
there's
on you.
I know, right? All bibliophiles recoil in horror at that. It's for traveling. You go on a
Okay,
backpacking
whatever.
trip, you can't lug around the library. I do prefer physical books for the record. But anyway, on the home screen, there's always like, and probably you could pay to get rid of this, but there's always like ads that you don't choose that are displayed. So even when it's off, when you pick it up, there's like an ad for something that you can buy on Kindle. And I've been definitely surprised to notice that I feel like at least 60%, I would guess, of the fiction, and it's mostly fiction that's advertised, tends to be sci-fi or fantasy of some kind, especially fantasy. So there's clearly a hunger that is satisfying. But I agree that my experience with fantasy, I've never really cared for it all that much, and certainly not really once I got past like almost grade school. I would say I just feel like it. Yeah, maybe it is what you're saying, that it's too obvious with the archetypes, and kind of once you've read one fantasy story, you've kind of read many of them at least.
But you could
Sci-fi.
never say the same for sci-fi.
Yeah,
Almost by definition.
I feel like you could say maybe this, that sci-fi is still working within archetypes, but it's inventing new versions of them. Um, like you could consider like Neo in the Matrix being a new type of hero, and even though that's piggybacking on cyberpunk from the late '80s and early '90s, like that was kind of the invention of a new sort of hero, which still fits within a larger archetype, like anything will do. And I'm sure there's fantasy books that have done this too, like within the genre, but like that is enough to kind of change the cultural view of what a hero can be, that sort of anti-hero waking up from the illusion, Plato's cave type of like philosophical ascent. And that was suddenly like a heroic thing in movie form. I'm kind of spitballing there, but maybe you can invent new versions of the archetypes in speculative fiction, whereas fantasy is kind of left to retread the same territory where the king is the king and the wizard is the wizard. You know what I mean?
I mean, I think, okay, we can. First, I want to talk about the sci-fi, but I think there's something to be said for fantasy, but under the right conditions. But
Not dismissed. Yeah.
In the case of science fiction, though, it seems like either I think it depends on the sci-fi story, because there are subgenres, there are different writers, there are people who straddle both worlds. Someone like C.J. Cherryh, for instance, writes pretty fantastic hard science fiction, and was known for writing some pretty, extravagant fantasy stories as well.
Yeah.
So it seems like the kind of story they're trying to tell is going to influence the way they do things. But it seems like because what I was saying is somehow there's a sort of going beyond archetypes with sci-fi, but what you're saying is it kind of fits with what you were saying earlier too, that maybe there's not a complete transcendence of archetypes as much as there's a kind of challenging the traditional limitations on what qualifies as a representation of this or that archetype.
Yeah, based on changing scenarios or changing human capacities, because technology does and has allowed us to remove what were previously severe limitations, and then that had consequences. And I think when that occurs, or when you're speculating about that it may occur, that can require updating the concrete versions of various archetypes. And I'm sure,
so in a certain sense, like, sorry, go ahead.
So I'm sure, like, we could think of Well, I kind of was thinking of this because I feel like Dune certainly has a hero's journey at its core in structure, but at the time that was a fairly unique and innovative type of hero. I feel like, as is Neo in the Matrix, and I'm sure we could come up with many others if we continued down that road. But to kind of tie it into Dune, like, I feel like that's what it is. It's a hero's journey. It's following that Joseph Campbell structure, basically, but it seems like a different sort of hero than maybe what was common in fiction before. And you're more familiar with the book, so you can maybe comment on that more than I really can. But that's
I think that's really true, because I think just kind of give a non-science fiction example first of like, and just basically a cultural example. The idea of, think of like just the jock versus the nerd.
Yeah.
You know, at one point in time, you know, jocks were on top, not just because they could beat up the nerds, but because the world was such that you needed to rely on people who could beat other people up, because there was not a lot of security. So that the idea of, you know, and obviously this is speaking with rather large categories, but the hero is like the guy, the big guy, the strong guy. But as time has gone on, it seems like the nerd, you know, the intelligent person, the inventor. That's actually one of the things, like in Foundation, by Isaac Asimov. There's some really interesting. The book, I haven't seen the TV show that they're making. Apparently, it's terrible. But
I've heard it's insanely complicated, not in a good way. But I haven't seen it. So,
because one of the interesting things in Foundation is that by reflecting on and kind of adjusting the whole idea of psychohistory, that if you can somehow project at least a macro level what the future is going to look like, what it means to be a hero at that point is no longer the intrepid person staring into the unknown, but someone who kind of lets things kind of play out and sort of seizes an opportunity here and kind of lets something else slide over here. It's sort of the patient guerrilla warfare hero becomes much more kind of on top, and the person who helps to hasten history forward in Foundation. And that is, and he explores that in multiple ways. I've only read the first book, but it's still made up of, I think, 5 related kind of short stories. In which that theme comes more and more to the fore, that in light of this adjustment of the limitation, the people who actually wind up being the protagonists of the stories, the people you would expect to be the heroes, are not at all heroic in the traditional sense, and yet they're still the ones fulfilling, you know, satisfying the sort of the dramatic arc of the hero. And it winds up being really strange. I didn't enjoy Foundation as much as Dune, but Dune's fantastic.
I guess to speak to that real quick, that's maybe even just kind of repositioning the archetypes. You could almost say that the hero is still the hero in terms of the one who's undertaking the action that moves the story forward, but in another way, like, the hero is really more the wizard type of character, and you're actually viewing the unfolding of events from the perspective maybe more of the wizard than you are of the prototypical hero. So you're kind of repositioning archetypes there, where like previously you wouldn't ever really get a story from the point of view of the wizard. You always get it from the hero. So
there it seems almost like one of the things that it's accomplishing is not just a repositioning, but almost trying to show that the archetypes perhaps are less embodied than you might think. There's a distinction between sort of people who have embodied the archetypes under different circumstances, and the archetypes we have themselves. That it's possible to be heroic under other circumstances, and it's not going to look the same thing, and yet you're still, like you're saying, you're still functionally an archetype, or archetypically the hero. In the case of Dune, it's even more interesting, but it's a lot more subtle.
What's your take on the Dune story? I mean, you're so much more familiar with it than me. I just kind of know the bullet points and what I saw in the movie. So I don't know. What do you get from Dune? Like, what wows you so much about it? Because you seem wowed.
It's I mean, the world is as dense as Middle Earth, and Tolkien apparently hated Dune with some passion, but he did read it, and I get the impression he hated everything he didn't write. But
I get that sense too,
but what's weird is especially just watching what really didn't come across in the movie, but I'm kind of happy they didn't try to detail, because it's so cerebral and implied in the book that even reading the book, you don't really realize what's going on until about 300 pages in. But
Okay.
the underlying what if in Dune is it all comes back to the classic. It all comes back to the classic. What if there's an AI takeover?
Okay.
And that's not immediately obvious either from watching the movie or just from reading the first few chapters of the book. But as you go along, you realize that the entire world in Dune, the entire universe in Dune, there are no aliens. First of all, there are no alien races, which is actually it's unique among sci-fi stories in that there's only humans who've adapted in various ways.
Yeah.
But the it's set in the far future, and kind of alluded to throughout the book is the kind of the troubled past, when at some point in time, presumably in the not too distant future from our perspective, there's a development of pretty sophisticated artificial intelligence. And then in classic science fiction form, they take over and there's a war to settle it. But it's viewing that idea, which is pretty tropey in sci-fi at this point. It's viewing that, but from the perspective of way in the future after that cataclysmic event.
Interesting.
And the idea is that civilization, human civilization, after the triumph against in the machine crusade, they call it.
Okay.
After the conquest at enormous cost, in rebuilding civilization, the first commandment of the Orange Catholic Bible, which is the religious text they've all got, is "Thou shalt not make a machine in the image of a man's mind."
Interesting.
So that the essential thing is we can have machines, but we can't have computers in the more sophisticated sense. So that affects, I mean, there's a reason that, like, when you watch the movie, when you read the book, it has a strong, exotic, almost fantasy world feeling, but it's not fantasy. It's extremely sophisticated, subtle, and elaborate science fiction that, if there's a culturally embedded resistance to the idea of artificial intelligence as absolutely verboten.
Yeah.
How would society and how would people and how would cultures at a grand scale respond to that? So that's the idea of the mentats in the book, which again does not come across too much in the movie. They're the guys with the tattoos on their lips.
Yeah.
And
okay.
They're basically superhumans who've been trained from a young age as extremely efficient calculators. So they're just human computers taking the place of the role of the original of what a computer and what a database is supposed to be. But what's interesting in the book is they also have personalities. So you can have like the main mentat, for instance, for the Atreides family. A big subplot in the book is that he secretly suspects that Jessica is trying to kill the Duke. So he's going after her, and she's trying to dodge him, but he's like hyper intelligent. But then alongside that, there's also the whole idea of the spice. Like, it seems like the Machine Crusade and the way distant past and the idea of spice, like, those are the two essential elements in Dune. You put those two things together, and you wind up with this just fascinating idea of the because the spice has.
What do you make of the so I love, and you're right, that did not come out in the movie. Nope. The Machine Crusade. So I appreciate you adding that element. And I'm curious what the spice represents to you. It's such even just that term spice is such a broad name. There's so many things that are implied by that. Well,
there's actually a name for the spice.
Okay.
Melange is the name of the spice.
Melange, but I think the way they refer to it is
doesn't come across in the movie.
Spice. There's a very mysterious quality to that, and they say that it seems to have like a visionary and hallucinogenic effects, in addition to facilitating interstellar travel. So those are some heavy. Those are some heavy qualities for a substance to have. Like, what do you make of that? What role does that play in the story?
Well, in the story, there's spoilers here, but I mean, they already kind of spoiled it in the movie. So
Okay.
if you've seen that, then it's not completely spoiled. But in the book, spice is hallucinogenic, but it also, for certain people of a certain mental caliber, if you are sufficiently addicted, it actually gives you the ability to kind of see into the near future and the
Hmm.
near past, which is
Hmm.
why the Spacing Guild navigators, the guys who fly the interstellar ships, there's no fast. The only way that they can navigate safe paths between the stars is by seeing into the future to see what's going to be there when they're there,
Oh, wow.
so that
Okay.
they can't fly
Okay.
their spaceships without seeing into the future.
So that's how it's facilitating interstellar travel.
Yeah,
Oh, wow. Okay, that's
which
another
is
detail
why
that does
they,
not come
which,
across.
but that's why one of the reasons that they don't want to they don't actually want to transform the planet Arrakis, because that's a theme that kind of gets mentioned in the movie, that they're trying to terraform the planet, except for the fact that the spice, which, and this will probably come across in the second movie because there's a really important scene where it comes up, but again, spoilers here. Spice is secreted, where it's the spice is a result of a strange chemical reaction, which Frank Herbert tries to explain in a very strange scene.
Mhm.
Um, but it's ultimately it's produced by the sandworms,
Sure.
which is why they're called the makers of the deep desert. They basically excrete the spice and it floats to the surface, so
Mhm.
that they didn't want to continue terraforming Arrakis because it's they'd get rid of the spice, so they couldn't actually, which is why the guild doesn't let satellites go over
Yeah.
Arrakis, because but it's all, so there are a couple like major, they're not MacGuffins in the traditional sense, but they're sort of like the what if of the Machine Crusade in the past, and the what if there was a substance that could have this kind of mind altering effect.
Yeah.
Um, and you put those two things together. Plus, well, there's also Paul himself, the idea of what if you could, what if you had the Bene Gesserit, the creepy witches,
Yeah,
who
right.
are crossing bloodlines, trying to basically force the hand of natural selection to produce the Kwisatz Haderach, who, when he gets addicted to spice, can see way into the future, which is
Yeah.
what's happening with Paul in all of his visions.
Yeah. Which, okay, so that's a lot. Wow, that's very
Yeah, I
illuminating.
know. There's so much there.
I need to read this book. I mean, I knew even at like multiple 3 hour installments, I knew there was going to be almost nothing of this sort, these sorts of element of the book that were going to get captured.
Yeah.
But I love the idea that, and even though those are such radical speculations and they take place in the extremely far future, to some extent, you could say that's almost the most brilliant sci-fi, because in a way, he's still commenting on what I would have to think would be current issues in his day.
Mm-hmm.
That the idea of artificial intelligence is something that, like, it's still speculative at that point, and really still basically is now that it's getting much closer. But I'm sure far-seeing individuals who are, nearby in proximity to the scientific world would kind of see that, yeah, we're going to get there at some point. Computing power is going to massively increase. We'll be able to do this. And so what would happen then? And in a brilliant move, I think that you highlighted, what would humanity, if it survived that cataclysm, be like afterwards? Which I agree is the brilliant bit of speculation, because normally the speculation ends at that war, and either we win it or we get demolished, but then it doesn't really carry on after that. So I would think that that would be something that he's thinking of, that is a current question in his day. And also, and I can't help but think that, like, when he was writing in the 60s, that psychedelics would have just been surfacing in
I was just thinking that
in
actually.
Western society. And he's connecting, what if this has power and we have a machine war? But then the brilliant move, I think, is to extend that massively in the
Yeah.
future, and have a coherent narrative of what that might be like if these two forces take humanity in that direction.
And frankly, just what's really, I think, just the thing that makes Dune just so much, because those are all great ideas, but the fact that he can actually deliver on it
Yeah.
and just create this extremely intricate world, where kind of like what you're saying with Beggars in Spain, like it takes an idea,
Yeah.
but it really pushes, because it has the time to do it. It really pushes these ideas, like what would it be like down to what it really would feel like to live in a world conditioned by those situations.
And what kind of heroes would we need in that
Yes.
sort of world? And I think that's the learning, because you get
Yeah.
to go through this hero's journey in this crazy alternative future, but in a way you're inventing a new archetype that might be of service somewhere down the line.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you make? What do you make of like the hero's journey in the story? Like, what's the characterization like in the book?
It's. I mean, everything is, generally speaking, everything is better in a book because
Sure.
there's just so much more you can say. But Paul is younger in the book than he is in the movie, and that definitely has an influence. Like I thought that it was pretty well done. I know a lot of people have quibbled about where the movie chose to end, even though it actually ends where Frank Herbert ends the first third of the book.
Okay.
But in the movie, it's not as obvious what the emotional arc of that story is, but in the book, it's Paul's being confronted with these visions of this crusade he's going to have to lead. He he knows. The thing is, what's interesting in the book is that he knows that it's all farce, but
Mhm.
in order for the future to be accomplished, in which he's the Kwisatz Haderach and he's overthrowing the Imperium and really kind of bringing the world into a better future, it needs to happen that way. So he doesn't want to lead the crusade. He doesn't want to lead this bloody, violent holy war.
Mhm.
But kind of built into that is he's never killed anybody, and he's still innocent in the book. He's still he's still a kid. So
Mhm.
that the arc is him. It's actually rather tragic, and Frank Herbert even mentioned this multiple times. Just like it's meant to be, there is a kind of Greek tragic arc to the idea that he's as he grows, he also has to, in a certain sense, he has to sacrifice something of himself in order for this future to take place.
Mhm.
And that comes across much more poignantly, I think, in the book.
Yeah.
Which
It
is,
ki-
but again, even that isn't simply like this interesting literary idea alongside these speculative things. There's also, and this kind of touches even on themes in the movie Arrival,
Yeah.
where what happens if you are in fact, if you know the future,
Yeah.
and you're not in this position of ambiguity about the future. If you know the future and you know how things are going to play out, does that alter your moral responsibility in the
Yeah.
here and now?
Yeah.
And I kind of think that I haven't read Dune Messiah, the first sequel, which was written, I think, fully written at the time he published the first book. So it still has the most, because a lot of people have said don't read any of the others. They're not as good and they kind of ruin it. But it seems like in Dune Messiah, it's still the most imbued with the spirit of the original book.
Mhm.
Apparently, he goes into there's sort of like the completion of the Greek tragic arc,
Okay.
where in the book it ends on a high note, but it's really a tragic arc. There's going to be a downfall moment too. So I don't know if what Frank Herbert thinks of the idea of that kind of altered moral responsibilities, but that's just his genius right there. Is that even in that really kind of that moral quandary and that interesting, poignant literary space, he's still speculating and he's still reflecting on the implications of these ideas that are driving the whole story.
That is, yeah, that's beautiful. That's perhaps maybe, I feel like you would have to consider that to be kind of the high point of what science fiction can do.
Yeah,
But I like that way of phrasing it, that even in the literary space, he's still speculating.
yeah,
Even with, it's maybe that he's speculating with archetypes, speculating with what, um how to put it, yeah, I don't know, envisioning new types of people.
yeah,
You speculate about the environment, that raises ideas about people, which then raises more ideas about the environment because they're going to affect it. And then you kind of see that loop, and that's a brilliant way of seeing the human condition as one of just endless speculations like
yeah.
that. But then to tie that into knowing the future, I think also connects, because then there is no speculation. And does it change your moral obligations if you can't take that as a given, that you're always speculating what the future is going to be, and literally no one has any idea.
Yeah,
So
it's there's a lot to sink your teeth into in Dune, and it seems like, to kind of make a plug for science fiction, and maybe I'm preaching to nobody who actually has any interest in hearing this, but at least there's a strain of kind of young conservative types, conservative Catholic types in particular, which is what I'm familiar with, who have kind of been reared on a suspicion of technology as somehow technology and sort of the technical mindset, technical rationality of the dreaded Enlightenment,
yeah.
that somehow is foreign to the beautiful and foreign to the artistic, and that as technology increases, artistic sensibility and the appreciation of the beautiful is supposedly going to decrease in inverse proportion.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like if you're open-minded about reading science fiction, that's just not true. Like, it seems like something like Dune, and there are other things too, I know, but then the quintessential version of this just literary masterpiece, is unthinkable without the ambiance of, because the whole idea of technical rationality makes possible this question of, well, if the world actually isn't completely immutable, but we can actually do things to it that change it, and maybe change it dramatically, that realization is the kernel of what makes science fiction possible.
Mm-hmm.
So that in the sense of like, oh, then what if we imagine this or that or this or that change? You don't get that kind of thing prior to sort of the late Enlightenment era in which we're living. So it seems like, just as kind of an apologia for the artistic quality of science fiction, sort of a positive view on technical rationality, which I know is not the main thing we're talking about, but it just seems like it's the very fact that Dune is such a rich piece of art.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so much there to think about, and many really interesting moral and philosophical questions it raises. I think that alone, and you could give other examples, belies the idea that somehow the increase of the technical mindset necessarily spells the doom of the artistic and the beautiful mindsets.
I like that. I really like
you may that. You may not be as nearly frustrated by that tendency as I am, but that tendency among people. But it's definitely something that's on my mind. So, I'm always looking for, when I'm reading science fiction, I enjoy it, and I want to, it just seems like, why do I enjoy it? Because it's good.
Mm-hmm.
That
is fascinating. I think there's kind of a reactionary, and I mean, I think in many, even in some circles in which I don't think people wouldn't describe themselves as conservative in normal senses, I feel like that's a reason perhaps maybe that fantasy can be a bit of escapism, is that people don't think that a technical and rational world is something that can be beautiful, and you need to return to these realms where in most fantasy it's much more in tune with the natural world. You're tapping into the natural magic of things. It's usually more out in the outdoors, in the woods, and set in an ancient time, with the tropes of ancient times like castles and dragons, and this far away like time in the past, when a much more like Garden of Eden type, post Garden of Eden, but that kind of like, back when it was all simpler and pure. Yeah. I totally get that. That is an appeal. Like, everyone wants to go back to Eden in some way. Like, I think we even get just the concept of home itself from that feeling of wanting to get back there. But I like what you say about seeing the fact that actually our relationship with the world, with the material world, is something that will develop no matter what, and that the understanding and the mastery of that relationship from a moral standpoint is a beautiful thing, and is a fuller realization of human potential that is best actualized. Because it's true that we could destroy ourselves through misuse of our technological relationship with the environment. But that's all the more reason why we have to consider the moral dimension of that, which science fiction allows you to do. And if we can come to terms and come to conclusions morally about how, who are we in relation to the environment. By removing limits and speculating about them, perhaps we can prepare ourselves to make the correct moral choices when and if those limitations fall. Because you could break it down to, with great power comes great responsibility, and when you're removing limits, you have far more power, but are you responsible enough to handle it? Well, if you've thought about these moral issues ahead of time, maybe you are. Maybe we could be.
Yeah, it almost seems like, because I mean, I like fantasy. I don't want to send the impression that
I don't want to trash it either, but I think there's a definite, back to the good place.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Kind of
I think that's true. I think that in a certain sense, I would say that science fiction needs fantasy and fantasy needs science fiction. I think that a healthy, if you're going to lead an otherwise philosophical life and you're going to read fiction, I think it's important to read both of them, because science fiction, like you're saying, science fiction is a way of responsibly and creatively thinking about, given that we can change the world, how will we change it? How should we change it? And how can we make sure those two align?
Yeah.
But on the other hand,
because by changing the world, we are changing ourselves, like it or not. Yeah. So we have to consider that. Yeah.
Because it also seems like in the case of fantasy attests to, in a certain way, fantasy attests to the more innate things in us that no amount of change, external change, is going to completely extinguish. I think Ursula Le Guin talks about the writer of fantasy as someone who speaks the language of the night. And Chesterton, who I don't normally like to quote Chesterton on most things because I find it annoying, but he makes the interesting point that the Christian allows the twilight. There's a sense you permit the twilight, or something along those lines, where there's the idea that somehow, if science fiction is about exploring the possibilities of how we can use human power, it seems like fantasy at some level is always either assumes or is about running up against the limits of human power, like human power up against these larger, deeper, more primal and kind of and darker powers that we can't. I mean, a classic example of that is the Earthsea trilogy, which is a fantastic.
Yeah, that's another thing I have to read. That's definitely on my list, alongside Dune. Yeah,
it's obvious to me that she also wrote science fiction.
Yeah,
the way she does fantasy has a lot of similar elements, but there it's very clear that there's this sense of there are powers beyond just the human power. There are imperatives or there are laws in the universe that we simply can't change, and that fantasy seems to be, kind of by highlighting the idea of this sort of world in which technology has never emerged. It seems like what you're doing in fantasy is sort of reflecting on there are permanent responsibilities we have as human beings with respect to these permanent or insuperable laws we find in nature, and that which is why I think you need to have both fantasy and science fiction in your philosophical arsenal, because we can change the world, but there are certain limits to how much we can do. There's becoming and there's being, and you can't reduce reality to just either one of those. They're both there. And to be somewhat pithy about it, I think you could say that fantasy really helps us to focus more on being, and sci-fi more on the exigencies of becoming. And as long as both being and becoming are in the world and we have to live in the world, we need both fantasy and science fiction.
I like that. I really like that. I also enjoy the comparison to the night and allowing the twilight, because it is true that there's broader symbolism in fantasy, and I dismissed it a little bit earlier as generic and more general, but perhaps that is akin to dreaming, to the concepts of the subconscious, or the concepts of maybe the collective subconscious, these images and roles and forces that we all kind of carry under the surface within ourselves, and how wise that is to keep those in mind when you're seeking to change things by daylight. What is lurking in the night that may be influencing the moral decisions that we make in relation to technology. And so paying attention to dreams, paying attention to those kind of the things of like deep time, which I guess you could say maybe fantasy is deep time. Like it's never really set in a specific time. It's just way back, way back. And I feel like that's
long time ago.
Yeah, that's where the contents of our collective unconscious, if we acknowledge some existence of that, where it comes from. So I love that point. I think that does make me see fantasy in a new light. And Le Guin, I know, is always highly spoken of. And I think
She's fantastic.
I think straddling sci-fi. I've read some of her short fiction, like Coming of Age and Carhide.
I've only read the Earthsea, and not even all the Earthsea books, just the original trilogy that she published.
It's set in the Earthsea universe. And then I've read the one that's like really famous, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas.
Which is like just a sketch, really. It's like
a powerful sketch, yeah. But that tends to even be included in like literature collections. It's not even.
She absolutely belongs in literature. She's incredible.
Yeah, but I love what you said there. I think maybe perhaps her straddling both sides of the fence, so to speak, is perhaps a more complete picture gives her a more complete grasp of the human condition, because you're right, it is being, it's becoming, there's primordial forces that are shadowy, we're not aware of, but very much affect what we do. And then there is also the concrete, like we will change things, so how should we? And both of those need to be factored in. But I particularly enjoy the idea of who said allowing the night? Where was that
P.K.
from?
Chesterton, from Orthodoxy at some point.
Interesting.
But he's criticizing in particular the kind of the need to explain everything, and the idea that if you haven't explained everything, then you're somehow weak-minded and foolish. He's like, nah,
sure. And
you have to allow the twilight.
And that's magic itself, allowing magic. And even in a more literal sense, you could see that, because I think he references Christianity in that quote, it sounded like, and you could say kind of the reminder of something like original sin is something like allowing the twilight as well. Like, don't get carried, like it's great, the power and capacity over the environment we have and what we're doing, but don't get carried so far away with this that you forget the fact that like we're flawed. There's original sin. We're never gonna, we're not able to perfect our natures as quickly or as completely as you think we can. There's always going to be envy. There's always going to be greed. The circumstances may change, but those things are in us as well, in the night, buried in the night.
That's another theme in Dune, actually. Barbarism, residual barbarism.
Residual barbarism, yeah. But that's something that cannot be forgotten, and that's something that's very much in the night, yeah. Okay, well, perhaps that's a good spot to leave it there. I think it's went in a direction that I wasn't expecting, but I think I've come to appreciate, I think just with these last few minutes, I think fantasy a little bit more when I'd kind of written it off. I still just the trope, the trappings of it, I just always find annoying in a way that I don't find, in a way that I don't really get from most sci-fi, at least, quality sci-fi.
Yeah, Earthsea is great. It's short. Each book, they're not, because that's another thing that's really annoying about fantasy. The mega series,
I know,
book, like 1,000 pages, and there's 10 books in each one. Like people are like,
know.
you got to try the Wheel of Time, man. I'm like, okay, no. Also, there's a lot of ripoffs of Dune in the Wheel of Time, but that's for another time. But
Sure.
Earthsea, each novel is fairly short, and at least just the first three, the ones in which I don't want to spoil anything, but it's it's just beautifully written, and she's not super tropey.
Okay, cool.
So,
yeah. Well, I think this was definitely illuminating. I think we should do a follow-up sci-fi where we talk to our dad, who is a huge sci-fi buff, and I would like to get his takes on it. But I think that I'm curious to see where this mini journey of getting back into sci-fi in the short fiction form, like where it'll take me. And there's already been some that have really stood out to me just in this more recent reunion with it, where it kind of reminded me like, oh yeah, that's why I like this. That's why I like this genre. So we'll see how that goes. But I think we'll leave that until next time, and maybe we should do a guest appearance on that.
That'd be awesome. I think it's a great idea.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, thanks for joining me, Ben. We will be back soon.
Absolutely.
All right.